My name is Adam Foss. I was a prosecutor in Boston for almost a decade and then started this organization called Prosecutor Impact, which does lots of things, mainly trying to train prosecutors in things like cultural competency, racial equity, et cetera, et cetera. I'm super excited to be moderating this panel because a lot of my heroes are up here. But I kind of also just want to take a moment and recognize that there is a prosecutor panel happening right now with 5 black people on it. And when I started this job, the idea that this would ever happen was like, you know, nothing that I could have imagined. So I really, I just wanted to call that out because it's important to me, and I know it's important to the other folks who are up here. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on the dopeness of the bios that you have in your packets. I would encourage you to take a look at them. You have people on this panel who have broken down barriers that were seemingly impenetrable, becoming the firsts of firsts of firsts. You also have one of my very dear friends who comes from this world, from the community organizing sector, doing a lot of work on radical policy, pushing all the people on this panel and many, many other people in a direction that is uncomfortable but definitely necessary to be pushed in. So Marby there on the end, we will hear from her as well. We are now joined by this handsome gentleman. Also a first, Mr. Wesley Bell, the prosecuting attorney for St. Louis County. I had the opportunity to meet with this brother not too long ago and spend some time in his jurisdiction and learn a lot about the work that he is doing, so I'm looking forward to getting into this conversation. I want to frame the conversation about progressive prosecution, particularly given the people who are on this panel, by reading the following. This is the president of the Massachusetts District Attorneys Association writing in an op-ed in the largest newspaper in New England about the true role of the prosecutor. And this is his explanation of the racial disparities that exist in the Massachusetts criminal justice system, which are second worst in the country. The social determinants that lead to the commission of crime are complex. Yet the criminal justice system, the repository of society's failures, easily becomes a target. It's harder to blame, for example, this disintegration of the family, a lack of respect for discipline and education, and the glorification in some communities of a culture that celebrates disrespectful language and misogyny under the guise of art. I suspect that these factors are more influential regarding who is in jail and prison than an inert criminal justice system. That is the head prosecutor of our state's attorney's office talking about why there are racial disparities in our criminal justice system. If it is unclear to you why it is so important that these people are sitting at this table and not this dude, then there's like a tech panel happening around the corner. This is one of the most offensive things that I've ever read. I'm considering whether or not to file a bar complaint because you cannot have the discretion that you have in this job and blame the racial disparities in your jurisdiction on rap music, the disintegration of the family, and a culture of lack of disrespect for education and discipline. That is like, you should be gone. All of you should be tweeting about that and asking this guy to get taken out. I'll stop there. Rather than reading the bios, again, they're in your materials, what I'm going to start by doing is just asking in 3 minutes or less each of the panelists to introduce themselves, not hitting on all the important parts of their resume, but talking really about why is it that they were the ones who stepped out to take all of the arrows of this wave of progressive prosecution. So we will start with the Honorable Aramis Ayala.
Thank you, Adam. Good morning, everyone. It's always an honor to be here and talk because I think that we underestimate the value of dialogue quite frequently because dialogue is rarely followed up with action. So that's the goal here. I am the elected prosecutor out of Orlando, Florida, where I have 2 counties, and it is when I tell people who I am, I really, as I just told Adam a little bit earlier, I'm just a little girl who's an introvert who had dreams of justice, and I just grew up, right? And then I grew up in that concept of truth and justice was then modified by education and experience and a passion to understand who I was and the world in which we live. So I'm the same person that my fifth grade teacher knew, just a little bit more polished. And what happened is when I took office in 2017, I was faced after I was sworn in with a formal ceremony, swearing in on Friday, family in town. And on Monday, I had a law enforcement officer who was killed by a fugitive who had just killed his girlfriend a couple months later. And it was at that point I was challenged and presented with the question, am I who I really say I am? And do I stand for what I really say that I stand for? And when I decided not to seek death penalty, I proved to the world that I am.
Bell.
Good morning. First, I want to. I'm disappointed. I have my orange handkerchief, and to acknowledge gun violence awareness. And so, forgive me for being a few minutes late. I scrambled to the shop downstairs, and I got my sunglasses and some orange Tic Tacs. So, and there's a little burnt orange in there, if you will. So first, it's an honor to be with these excellent colleagues, if you will. And talking about my story, I look at it more of as an evolution. I was a professor, criminal justice professor, and I think like many people have realized, it changes your life to live close to work. And so I moved close to my job, the school that I worked in and that I was hired in to run that department. And a year later, or a year or two later, Ferguson happened. And so that was my first venture into politics. But I felt that as a criminal justice professor, as a former public defender, at the time I was a municipal court prosecutor. I feel like with my expertise, I think I was obligated to get involved and be a part of the solution. And so once you start to see once you start to see these inequities up close, it can be empowering to start to be a part of the change. And so working on the Ferguson City Council, I was part of the negotiation team with, and I have to clarify, President Obama's Department of Justice. We worked on we helped write and worked on the Ferguson consent decree with some of the broadest reforms in the country with respect to community policing, with respect to court reforms, and to be able to sit in the room. There were times we would be sitting in the room at Christy Lopez, many of you may know her, 10 hours on a few occasions. It was an eye-opening experience to see what other jurisdictions were doing. And that was also empowering. And once we started to turn that ship with Ferguson, it's kind of like you start seeing, well, what else is in the crosshairs and what else can we do to help this region? And in 15 minutes from me is Clayton, where the prosecutor at the time, many know him, was still in office. And I think that it was a call to duty to make that run and try and be a part of that change. And quite frankly, no one thought we could win outside of a handful of people on my team. But win or lose, I just thought that we had to make a stand. We had to push for changes that we believe in. We had to address these issues because they're too important to sit back and do nothing. And I'll close just by saying a conversation that I had where someone that a good friend of mine, but you also know him too. I'm not going to put him out there because he's actually a great guy. But he said, like, why would you do that? Like, why would you run against this guy? And my response was simply, why wouldn't I? You know, this when we see issues like mass incarceration, criminal justice reform, we're talking about people's lives. It's not just a hashtag or a empty cliche or rhetoric. These are people's lives that we're dealing with. So when we implemented our policies on day one, much like my colleague from Orlando, people will say, well, why are you moving so fast? Well, you know, one day longer that someone has to be incarcerated and lose their freedom when it's not just, when it's not fair, when it's not, you know, I think that's just too much. That's too long. So, again, honored to be here with Adam and the rest of my distinguished colleagues, and looking forward to the panel.
Is Brave Boy from Prince George's County?
Yes, but I'm a native Washingtonian, actually. There are just a few of us left. But it's an honor and privilege to come across the line, as I do often, to be in the nation's capital and with all of you today. Again, my name is Aisha Braveboy, and I am the elected state's attorney for Prince George's County. I took office in January of this year. So I've been there for a relatively short time, but in that short time, we've made a lot of progress. I started out probably non-traditionally. I was not a prosecutor. However, I worked for about 15 years in juvenile justice reform. I started really because I noticed that kids from my high school were skipping school. And I said, what are we going to do about that? So I worked with the school resource officer to basically develop a program where if we saw young people leaving school, we would follow them to find out where they were going and what they were doing, and of course escort them back to school. Because what I knew even back then was if they were not in school, they would likely get into trouble and they would wind up in the criminal justice system. So long story short, 15 years later, we started out doing a truancy initiative. 15 years later, we had worked with our Department of Juvenile Services to become one of their referral programs. Our program is called the Community Public Awareness Council, and we involve citizens, residents in our county with hearing cases of young people who had come into contact with the criminal justice system. And instead of them being prosecuted, they were referred to our diversion program. And for over 15 years, I served as general counsel and one of the founders of that program. And we were able to divert over 4,000 children from our criminal justice system. And this year, thank you. And this year, they reached now, I'm no longer involved because of my new role, the 5,000 mark. So we are really pleased about that. But in this new role, and I hope to be able to talk about it as we get further into the discussion, we are going to have an even greater impact on our young people, because now I'll see those kids who do get referred to the prosecutor's office. But we have now a system that I'll talk about in a little bit to give even those young people a second opportunity to stay out of the system. And so I'm excited about that, and I look forward to hearing the discussions and questions this morning.
Thank you.
Hello, y'all. How's everyone doing? I'm a call and response girl, so that's going to be throughout. I'm going to be like, what y'all think about that? So hello, my name is Marbre. I use she and her pronouns. I work for Law for Black Lives, which is an organization of about 4,000 progressive and radical lawyers across the country who support movement work and support radical change. And by radical, I mean grasping at the roots of the problem. And so not just addressing symptoms, but really going deep. I'm going to set my alarm because I come from teachers and preachers, so this could take a minute. I'm going to be succinct. But really, when I kind of think about what brought me into this work, I think about my childhood. And so I come from a family in which my mom ran the first battered women's shelter in California for over a dozen years and worked tirelessly, actually often, to defend women who prosecutors put in jail for killing their abusive husbands, right? I also am the daughter of a person who struggled with drug addiction my whole life, and so watched my father in and out of courtrooms, out of cages, out of jails, because what he needed was actually some support to get recovery, but instead what he got was an investment inside of cages and prisons, right? And also I'm a Black woman in the US who has seen rape and domestic violence happen to folks I love, and also watched the system fail those survivors over and over again. And so I come both to this panel and to the law and to this work with a deep, deep suspicion about this system. And when I was young, I thought the problem was there weren't enough Black people in it, that if I just had the power or the voice to be able to be a public defender or to be an advocate, that I could change the outcomes for the folks I loved. And what law school did to me, among a lot of other things, is that it showed me that, in fact, it wasn't just that we needed more kind of advocates who were good people, that actually this system was beyond broken. I think so often we talk about a broken system, but in fact, this system is operating exactly how it's supposed to operate, right? It was formed and created, and law school would teach you this if you look carefully. Other professors would try very hard to make sure you don't see it. But the entire system was created to exploit and control Black and brown people, bodies, and capital, right? And throughout history, the law has and is still being used to legitimize that inequality in basic ways and to maintain it, right? And so I come here after a long time. This was not my position when I was 18, but is now at 34 as an abolitionist. And what that means, I think, as it pertains, oh yes, are there abolitionists in the house? Okay, I feel I'm on like a panel of prosecutors, so that makes me feel a little better. Thank you for that. And what that means, I think, as it pertains to this panel, is probably 4 key things. I'm gonna do them real fast. One is, I think that the criminal legal system is an inheritance of slavery. And I also think that it runs on the same logics, the same kind of organizing logics as slavery. And so whether or not an overseer is a good or bad overseer, I am seeking to abolish the use of overseers, right? Like, I don't actually think this system could serve us, and I don't think it can be yielded for good. Like, I don't actually believe that's the case. I think we have to dismantle it. And that is a generational project. It won't happen today or tomorrow. But my investment in reforms, in tactics, in strategies, including in DA strategies, is actually to open space to deconstruct this system and to move and shift power. Secondly, I believe people don't belong in cages. I don't think that cages help address safety issues. I don't think that violence helps prevent violence. And I'm very clear that the state's use of prosecutorial powers, of police powers, are violence, right? Whether that's because someone's in a cage because they jumped a turnstile, right? Or because they had a metro violation, or because they caused actual harm. I don't think that enacting more violence takes us to a place of more safety or less violence. And so I also believe that we have to, not only as we dismantle, that we have to be building. And so abolition is as much, if not more, about what we create, what we invest in, what we experiment with, as it is about what we dismantle, destroy, and defund. And so I think the vision of abolition is to create space for communities to experiment about what actually can prevent harm in the long run. And we know that that is not just the individual's behavior, but actually all of the systems, the economic systems, the political systems, the paradigm of punishment, that are much, much more deep-seated than any individual action. And then I also believe deeply in harm mitigation. And so that is part of why Lawful Black Lives has supported organizers in St. Louis, in Philadelphia, in Chicago, to both displace and to put in new prosecutors, because I believe deeply that there was a possibility in harm mitigation. But I also believe deeply that across the board, there's been some real failures. That prosecutors and DAs have not done all they could to shift power, to mitigate harm, or to reduce the reach of this system. And in some ways, they have sanitized the system and legitimized it even further. And so I'm really excited to engage both in the conversation about kind of what's been done really well, what's exciting, who's out of cages because of the work of these folks and others, but also some of the failures of this movement and of this system and the co-option that I think has happened. And that was 4 minutes, but I feel good about that.
That's pretty good. So, like, this is why it's important that these folks are up here. I heard a lot about duty and like, this is coming from a place that doesn't have anything to do with, like, I wanted to go get trial experience, or my dad was a prosecutor, or I want to be the governor of my state and this is a good lily pad. The people who are up here, whatever stripes they're wearing, are here because there is a deep-seated belief that something needs to be radically different. Wesley reminded me to just shout out that the reason that most of us are wearing orange up here, Marbury was on the road. She got late notice. All right. Yes, thank you, sir. It's Wear Orange Day, and that is to prevent. It's the national advocacy movement to prevent gun violence. The movement around Wear Orange has often been centered around mass shootings that are happening in schools. I am here to call out the children who have been terrified to go to school for their entire lives because gun violence and mass shootings in their neighborhoods have been durational and nobody shows up with a hashtag or a parade or a color. And so that's who I am wearing orange for today, and I know that I share that sentiment with other people on the panel. With sort of like this idea of duty and this calling to this work, there must have been some moment for all of you where you were like, oh shit, this is real now. And I'm going to start with you, Aramis, if that's okay. When was that like aha moment, like this is real, and what did you do in that moment to prepare?
So for me, the first moment was on the Friday after I was sworn in, and this was prior to the police shooting. In Florida, the death penalty had been declared unconstitutional twice in less than 2 years by the United States Supreme Court and the Florida Supreme Court. And at the time that I ran for office and took for office, there was no legitimate death penalty process in the state of Florida. So just side note, if anyone ever says that I was dishonest or I told people I believed, it did not exist, and it was never a conversation when I ran or when I took office. Sorry, period there. So in addition, so on the Friday after I ran, there was no death penalty. And there are 20 of me in the state of Florida. They are predominantly men. None of them are of color except for me. And I had went this entire time after being elected as being celebrated as the first black state attorney. I didn't know it when I was running because you don't run to be the first anything. It just happens to. I mean, I guess some people do, but that was never on my radar. When I took office, I was excited about what I could bring. But when I got on that phone call, Adam, that was the moment where I'm having a conversation with old, conservative, non-black people. And that was a very lonely moment because the conversation was almost foreign to me. The entire conversation was about the death penalty. It was never questioning the efficacy of it, the legitimacy of it, what the question was, it's not constitutional. What are we going to do to make it legit? And in that moment, I felt alone. In that moment, I felt like I was the only one who cared about life. And in that moment, I realized that I had a place in that entire group, and I was going to take a stand.
Yes. And Marby, I'm going to ask you an organizing question. Not now. You can drink your coffee.
Thank you.
But I think that there is something about this feeling of loneliness because for all of you, there was all this hype about you getting to this place and you have all of these people around you, and then all of a sudden when stuff gets hard, you're alone.
And the best way that I try to equate it is like a funeral. If you've ever had someone in your immediate family pass away, the day that it happens, everyone calls you, your phone is blowing up, emails and people stopping by the home, and then it kind of dies down. Then when the day of the funeral, everybody shows back up, and in the weeks later, you're all alone trying to process what is really happening. That's the best scenario that I can give.
Wes, you want to talk about your first sort of like aha moment, like, man, this is happening now, and I got to move in a direction.
Yeah, I think we had our election was essentially the primary, so there was no general election, and so we got an opportunity to prepare, and so meeting with community partners to expand our diversion programs. Meeting with law enforcement. Our jurisdiction is unique. St. Louis City and St. Louis County are not in St. Louis is not in St. Louis County, and so we have a ridiculous number of small municipalities, and there's about 55 to 60 police departments. So we made a point to meet with them, and so a couple quick things. Right before being sworn in, many of you may have heard about the Catholic Supply murder case. It was a horrible murder, and obviously the calls for the death penalty were coming, and my position was clear. And but speaking to that loneliness, that decision, it comes with us. I have a great team, and I know everyone up here has a great team. But when it comes down to making that decision, it's kind of like this room right now. Everybody on that team looks at you, and you have to make that decision, and it's your name. And on a positive note, I would say where it really hit me that this was real, that this was happening, was when we started getting some of our data back, and I believe I'm data-driven, research-driven. I think policy should reflect that. And when we got the first one of the first reports that were run that showed that the C, D, and E felonies in our jurisdiction, which are your nonviolent felonies, since we had taken over, have been reduced in the first 2 months by 12%, and in the first 5 months by 20% reduction in the jail population. Looking at the diversion programs, which my predecessor capped at about 75 a year for substance abuse treatment, and we're talking about a county of 1 million people. In our first 3 to 4 months, we had referred over 400 people to substance abuse, and that's when it started clicking that, okay, we're actually doing something good here. So I think that was the moment for me.
Very cool. Ms. Brayboy, Brother Bell talked about his election, and I remember talking to people like on his team in his camp like the week before, and it was just like, nah, like it was a good run. He's a good brother. And I remember like shouting from the rooftops when he won. You had a very different experience in that you won like 99% of the vote.
That was in the general, but in the primary, it was competitive.
All right.
I got about 63.2% of the vote in that. So yeah.
So when is so you actually had a primary and a general.
Yes.
What was your aha moment when the world started calling you up?
Well, when I took office, I gave, which all of us did, a speech during my investiture. And I mentioned several things I was going to do. And one of them was to create a conviction and sentencing integrity unit. And so I did that. But as soon as, some of the very important folks in the progressive movement heard about it, they began to bring cases to me of individuals who they would like me to reconsider either their convictions or their sentences. And there was a very important case of a young man who was at the time 16 years old who had committed a murder. And he had been in jail for about 30 years. He, was planning, in his current posture, he would have been in jail for at least another 10 or 15, possibly 20 years. He had been resentenced based on some of the the Supreme Court decisions. He had been resentenced to 58 years, but my predecessor had appealed that resentencing. And so I was asked whether or not I would be willing to drop the appeal. So of course, my predecessor and I have a great relationship, but we're different people. And so I said, well, let me review the case. And I personally looked at all of the supporting documents and ultimately came to the determination that this young man still has something to contribute to society. He had pretty much no dings while he had been confined. And he has shown the ability to get and receive training, and he had many certificates to show that. And I thought that he deserved an opportunity to rejoin us in society. And so I dropped the appeal. I also recommended that he be eligible for reentry court. And that decision I made about a month or two ago. And just yesterday, or the day before yesterday, I believe, I was in court with him, his parents, his supporters, and the judge resentenced him to reentry court. So for the next 6 months, he'll be in a local county jail receiving additional services. And after that, he will be at home being monitored for about 12 to 18 months of monitoring. But he has a job lined up, and he has a support system lined up. And it was just amazing. At that moment, I realized what my job was all about. It's not just prosecuting, but it's really providing justice. and it's a tough decision because he did something really, really bad. People don't stay in jail for 20, 30 years if they didn't. But we have to also understand our job is about knowing when redemption is possible and making those tough decisions too. And so I was very humbled to be in a position to do that. Not just for him, but for our community. And because of my decision, I didn't realize this, but it was the first time in our county, and we believe maybe even in the state, that this type of disposition has occurred for a juvenile lifer. And if he is successful, which I believe he will be, this will open the doors to so many other juvenile lifers and others who have lengthy sentences in our state. And to know that I was a part of that and made a decision that some might consider courageous, I consider it the right thing to do, but that can impact how people are treated and sentenced, and or the opportunities after sentencing for individuals who show that they have the ability to rehabilitate.
Yeah.
I'm humbled by that.
Yeah. I talk about all the time, like being a trial lawyer, we're told in law school, and we're told as prosecutors, like, winning a trial is the best feeling that you can achieve in this work. And what I think that we're all trying to instill in people is, like, there are bigger wins out there that have everything to do with that. Like,
absolutely.
Winning a trial is this momentary feeling of nothingness. But what you've done and what you're able to see, that is, like, at the core. None of this happens to the folks who are certainly on this panel, but obviously a lot of other people in the last 4 or 5 years, without community support and deep organization in communities to get these folks elected against institutional obstacles that have been there for centuries. Marbury, can you talk about the importance and the structure of that organizing, but also what is the accountability for prosecutors to those people who have gotten them to this seat?
Yes, absolutely. So I believe deeply and profoundly that the only kind of lasting change that's possible is through organizing. It's through building the power of people and of movements to both sustain change and to create change. And I also believe that those who are closest to the problem are also closest to the solution. And so I'm not under the impression that $200,000 and 3 years in law school made me an expert in these systems. I think that my father and my cousins and the folks I loved who have been through the bowels of this system are much more expert in it. And I think across the country we've seen, and I think about like aha moments. One of my aha moments, because I was about the PD life. I was like, I'm gonna be a PD. I'm gonna change the whole system from like this semi-outside position, and worked for the Bronx as well as for Bryan Stevenson during law school, and had this kind of profound moment and awakening of like, actually, there was no way to be inside these systems and transform them. That what actually has to happen is a complete and total transformation and destruction of these systems. And so I think Ferguson for me, and I spent time in Ferguson, joined the uprisings and since, was one of those moments where I saw the power of people. That in fact, when folks reach a point where they can't take anymore and refuse to and stand up against tear gas and against police with huge guns and big tanks, that in fact we can see change happen. I think that your election was like one of the symptoms of that change, but really it was the organizing ground game, whether in Chicago or St. Louis or Texas or any place you go, that allowed and tilled the soil for even the possibility of prosecutors who say things like the folks on this panel are saying. And so I just believe deeply in the power of organizing, and also in the reality that if we want long-term system change inside of the criminal legal system, it has to happen by giving more power, more resources, and more legitimacy to the folks who are organizing around this system. I think so often, and one of the things, and one of my critiques of what I see as kind of this prosecutorial movement, is that so much attention and resources, whether it's funders or media, is paid towards these single actors in this system, and it really ignores and erases what is decades of work. It was decades of work in Chicago that led to the Buy Anita campaign. It was 5 or 6 years of work in Ferguson and St. Louis that led to this election. So being really honest about, in fact, the ground in which people are elected, the kind of the change in narrative from tough on crime to even restorative justice and diversion, all of that is a product not of one person who's elected, but actually of this mass movement that refused to continue to be complacent in what is daily lethal violence of this system. And I don't want us to be at all mistaken or shy. People are being put in cages, being killed, their families are being destroyed by this system on a daily basis. And it is the organizers, the advocates who are really contesting that and making all of this, even this conversation, is possible because of their work and their dedication. So just to say that, shout out to all the organizers. I think the accountability question is a hard one. Prosecutors are accountable to nobody. Like, that's a fact. The whole system is set up to do that. And I think that there's this kind of mythology around co-governance, that if we have organizers, if you have some access, that in fact we are organizing or governing with people. And the reality is that the power differential between prosecutors and organizers, communities, survivors, and folks who have been identified as perpetrators is so vast that the idea of power sharing is impossible. And so I think one of the kind of questions I have and things I really am excited to push some of these progressive prosecutors towards is to think about, how do I actually reduce my power? Like, what are the steps I can take, that y'all can take, to actually shift power from a system that everyone at least agrees is not functioning? And I think for those of us who have deeply, deeply studied it and seen its impact, think that it's actually a rotten system. What are you doing every day to actually take power out of your office, out of you as a person, and moving it towards communities who are impacted? And to me, that means money. It's very interesting. I think across the country, progressive prosecutors are trying to get organizers on board to advocate for bigger budgets. And the answer is no. Like, you don't need any more money. The cops don't need more money. And prosecutors are part of law enforcement. It's a part of the police state, right? So I think it's important to name that, in fact, the funding game is a huge one. Power is resources. And so I think one thing that's important is thinking about, are you shifting funding? Another one is, are you shifting decision-making? Who's making the calls about this? Is there oversight? Is there transparency? Is there radical transparency? And I think that Kim Foxx was an amazing example of that prosecutors have data that we're not seeing because it indicts them, it indicts the system. And so are you radically sharing data is really important. But just to say, whether it's in the Supreme Court or locally, there really is no accountability for prosecutors. And so what we see is incredibly powerful individuals with full discretion to literally ruin people's lives. And even progressive prosecutors they have put people in cages for hundreds of years, right? That's like on everyone's hands. And so I think being real about that is really important, and demanding that there's actually a system change and a power change, not just lip service to that, and not just discretionary decisions that might improve some outcomes but don't change the system. And that, I think, is the road to accountability.
All right, I got to push back just a little bit, because here's the deal. Before I push back, I got to give credit where credit's due. I am in my position because of the groundswell that was made from the local organizers, and I still meet with them more frequently than I do other public officials, because it is them who is affected. And I tell everyone who's thinking about running for state attorney, if you are not having the support of those who are directly impacted, it's nothing but a popularity contest. So we have to be mindful of it. Now I'm going to push back. So when you say that we don't need more funding, I think in some situations that may be accurate, but in the situation that I speak for, that is absolutely inaccurate. I will tell you why. Because I work on a $30 million budget out of my office. And when the legislature got upset at me that I wasn't going to pursue death penalty, they penalized me by cutting my budget $1.4 million. And in that cut, I had to figure out how to maintain public safety, justice, maintain positions in a better economy where I can't pull people. And in the midst of my reforms that I promised to the people, my lowest staff position is my conviction integrity unit. The director of my conviction integrity unit is doing all of the work that she can on her own. We're trying to pull in interns. We already have things in the hopper to turn over people. And every single day that I don't have staff in those positions, that I have to decide, am I not going to prosecute cases and represent the people that I came to represent? Because too often we talk about those who are being locked up in cages. They actually look just like those who have been beaten and shot and killed by the people who put them there. So when you bring diversity to the table, you're also representing this cycle of people, because it's a revolving door in the criminal justice system. So I have to make a decision of, am I going to pull representation from the black and brown people who look like me, who their grandmothers are getting shot and their homes being robbed, or am I going to make certain that I'm going to look at my conviction integrity unit as well as my community engagement unit, so that I can be in contact with organizers like yourself myself to make certain that we're doing this. So when I have to juggle a dysfunctional budget because I'm being penalized from me trying to practice reforms, to say that that doesn't need to be funded, I completely disagree with that, because I could do much more work and be having a bigger and healthier conversation if I were better funded by our legislature.
Wes?
Yeah, I'm gonna add, because I think there is a middle ground that I think we may all be saying the same thing. So I'll give you a couple of examples. You know, my predecessor was not committed to diversion programs, treatment programs. There were 75 people in substance abuse, 12 people in mental health, and there was one attorney who handled every diversion court, and she was part-time. So she had a full caseload, homicides, and then, by the way, go handle these diversion courts. And so in order to start our diversion program, we had to take from another place in our office and create a diversion coordinator. And we just posted a position to hire our first social worker into that department. But we haven't gotten budgeted for that position. We have to take from another position. So we're robbing Peter to pay Paul. I believe in community engagement because I absolutely agree that without grassroots support, you're not going to have change. And so I believe that we have to have outreach. We have to let people understand not just the policies, but the why behind the policies. So I created, the first time in this particular office, a director of community engagement. Matter of fact, Captain Farmer, wave your hand out there. He's with me today. He's a former officer, and in our region in St. Louis County, there is no one that has been more committed over the last several years to community policing than this guy. And if you don't believe me, get on the social media page and you'll see all the great things that he's been doing. So, and by the way, we weren't budgeted for that position. We had to take one of our investigator positions. And so why that's important is that when I talked about that 20% reduction in the jail population, that was a result of that work. We're getting files. We have let every one of our attorneys know and educated them to pay attention to these cases that are potential diversion cases where these individuals can get substance abuse treatment, mental health treatment, and now those files are stacking up because we have one full-time person that can do it. We'll have two, but even that's not enough. But the middle ground is that that reduction, if we hold a reduction, matter of fact, if we just have a 5% reduction, we did this research prior to coming in office. A 5% reduction in the jail population saves St. Louis County about $1.5 million. Now we're on pace for 30 to 40%, similar to other cities like Philadelphia, and so we're talking about millions of dollars are saved. So the middle ground is that, and I think to both of these ladies' points, is that although we may need more money to do the things that we want to do, which are about social equity, giving treatment to people who need it, not incarcerating people, we're going to reduce the budgets countywide by millions of dollars. So I think there's a middle ground there. Is that, yeah, we might need a little bit more money, but we're going to save money, we're going to save resources, and we're going to get people out and back to their jobs, back to their families. And I think there is a win-win there.
I think that there can be, but I just want to say one quick thing before you push back at me, right? Which is all good. But I think that what you're saying is that ultimately the goal is to save the resources, but it's so important to remember over decades and decades of time, money, mentalities, and resources have been paid to get us here. Kumbaya is not going to get us out.
Yeah,
So.
and can I just say that I think you're right. We are part of a criminal justice system, and the question is, where has really the money in that system been spent? The majority of it is spent on housing and warehousing people, and that's a fact. That's reality. And so I think what we're trying to say is that if you invest in prosecutors like us, who will invest back in the community, who will look at those community programs that actually work for the people who we're all trying to serve. They can't do it for free. So they're going to have to invest in our ability to refer. I also plan to hire a medical director that can screen not just our juvenile cases, but some of our district court cases for diversion opportunities. But we are not medical experts in the state's attorney's office. So we need to hire those professionals in our office to assist us with making good decisions on behalf of those individuals who are relying on us to make good decisions and give them second chances. And so I think if you invest more in progressive, smart approaches through a state's attorney's office, we will have less people in the system because we will find opportunities for them in the community to be rehabilitated. We are in the best position to do that because nothing happens in the system unless we say so. The police can do their jobs, they can arrest 1,000 people, but unless we move forward with those charges, nothing gets prosecuted. And so it's a very important point to talk about because it is within our power to make the biggest difference in the outcomes for our communities. And so investing more in our offices, I believe, will produce better results, and it costs far less for us to refer individuals to programs within the community than to warehouse those same individuals in a county jail or a state prison.
Yeah.
Barbara, you got like 3 minutes of rebuttal.
Very good.
And then I'll have
rebuttal.
So we have
one for each person.
we have 6 minutes before Q&A. Somehow that happened. I have 78 questions that I still have to ask.
Well, thank you for the 3-minute rebuttal.
Do
I
the
appreciate
thing.
it. So I want to just start by saying prosecutors are not in the best position to solve communities or prevent harm. Communities are. Inside of communities, folks who have been working for decades to prevent domestic violence, sexual assault, to deal with drugs and mental health in humane and loving ways that don't perpetuate more violence, communities are best equipped to deal with community problems, number one. Number two, $30 million is a lot of money. It's too much money. And who's not getting that money is community groups who are trying to house folks, support young people, educational programs, interventions who are actually stopping violence as it happens. They have less than $20,000 in their budget. And so when someone says, I have a $30 million budget and that's not enough, we should ask some serious questions about that. Number two, stop prosecuting. Period. Stop, full stop, right? Lots of folks, both on this stage and not on this stage, are prosecuting drug offenders. That's not a reason to go to a cage. My dad did not need a cage, he needed a treatment program, right? And so it would be really easy to save money if you stopped prosecuting people. And that's across the board. And also, I think it's important to say, a majority of the cases that most of county and folks are facing are not violent crime. So also being clear about that, this is not always about people bring up cases of rape and murder. A lot of the folks through this system are actually in the middle of a mental health or drug crisis. And what's not happening is actually that there are harm or safety violation to folks around them. And also, even folks who are survivors, and I think this point was made, and it's an excellent point, is the same folks who are inside of cages, and I say cages on purpose, language matters, we are putting human beings in cages across the country. That is the job of folks on this stage, and across the country, that's real. And that's what's happening. That's part of the job. That's fair. Not the whole job, but definitely part of it. And I think it's also important to say the same folks who are in those cages are also survivors of crime that has gone untreated and unaddressed, right? And there hasn't been $30 million investment in actually addressing the harm and then what comes after that harm. And I think it's also important to say that, there are survivors. There was a great report, I think, by Americans for Safety and Justice about how survivors felt about prosecution and incarceration. And 10 years out, 5 years out, they're also not happy with this system. It's not keeping them safe. It's not solving them. And so we continue to invest in a failing system and expect different results. And when we don't get them, we, I think, often act surprised. And then lastly, and this feels really important, prosecutors should not be service providers. They should not get money to provide social work services, medical services. They are law enforcement. They're part of the police state and the law enforcement regime. They should not be social workers, just like cops shouldn't be either, right? And so how do we actually move money away from caging folks, surveilling folks, harassing folks, being violent against folks, and invest money instead in actually supporting and helping folks? And so I think it's really important. I mean, for instance, I know that, Mr. Bell, you just were part of passing or making a decision around prosecuting Metrolink violations. That's an investment of money to go with those prosecutions. Use that money and give it to community groups to do actual work to support folks and get folks out of poverty. I think that really matters, and there's a lot of money going to this system that shouldn't be going there.
Yeah, I mean,
Yeah, you said mine.
Absolutely. You're like,
you guys go. I'm
I
gonna go
just
get a
wanna-
coffee.
You know, I want to talk about a bigger issue, and I think President Obama articulated it the best, is that sometimes those of us on the left, we get into this circular firing squad, and we want this purity of positions, and and I think we have to have room to have these kind of conversations, and so I think that MetroLink is a perfect point. Is that these are where those tough decisions are made. And with the MetroLink, we've had a huge uptick in crime, and a lot of poor and disenfranchised people need the MetroLink to get to work. And so we made an announcement that we would prosecute no fare tickets, but the only reason we did that is to give notice to those who want to commit crimes that there will be a presence, a police, a law enforcement presence there. But I'm research driven. So if you want to know how many no fare tickets we've actually prosecuted since January 2019 when I took office, 0. And so my point being is that, look, we're all here on the same side. We may not see things exactly the same way, but everyone on this stage believes in trying to address these issues, and I think it's important that we do remember we're on the same team.
You know, I think that is that's what it really boils down to. I'm not being fake when I smile at my sister over here who, we're differing. It's a genuine connection, because we have to understand that while, like what Wesley has said, while we differ, I value differing opinions.
Yes.
Right. Because the concepts of absolute truth must be tried absolutely. If this is how I feel, I need to be challenged by someone who sees it differently than me. And I stretch as a leader when I allow different, that's what diversity is. We say we celebrate diversity left and right. Diversity is not just a few pepper flakes in the crowd. Diversity is how you think. It's where you come from, your life experiences. Her and I, if you look at us on a magazine cover, we look exactly the same. You would never know the diverse thought and the diverse experience. I grew up like a Cosby, well, not a Cosby kid, I can't say that anymore.
Yeah, don't say
But okay. I grew up with both my parents in the home. My parents were professionals. We didn't have drug issues in the house versus someone else who didn't grow up that way. So diversity is not necessarily the race, the gender. We had very different experiences. So same thing to what he's saying is that we have to value the discussion. We have to value the disagreement because it checks you. Is this really what you feel? And it stretches you. You make me look at things differently and be able to present my position differently. So I value that.
And I just have to call out that if this panel looked different, if this was, say, 10 years ago and the prosecutors who were representing these offices 10 years ago were up here, that conversation and that exchange between these folks could not happen because we have shared a struggle just looking at each other across the board. This is why it's important that representation is in these offices, full stop. 30 minutes for questions starting now. The microphone's there. You got to go up to the microphone. Let me stress again.
Oh, wow.
This is Q&A. Do not spend time on the microphone talking about how dope you are, or the idea that you have, or the comment that you've been dying to make. These people are up here because they want to answer your questions. Please honor and respect the other people by making a pithy, short, concise question that can be answered. Thank you.
Thank you, and thank you all for being here. I am a rising 3L, and I'm wondering, for those of us who are planning to go into prosecution and want to continue this work that you three are doing, and that we think is so important and so inspiring, we're not all going to get to go work for you guys. There are lots of prosecutor offices in the country that don't have these progressive-minded DAs or elected officials. So I'm wondering if you could give advice for future young line prosecutors who believe in these things that you do, but are maybe bound by these policies that we don't agree with, that we like issuing bench warrants for silly things, for XYZ. So I'm wondering if you could give us some advice.
My first job out of law school, I was a prosecutor, and I left after a cop lied on the stand. I became a public defender for almost 10 years, and then I came back. But the experience that I had as a prosecutor made me so valuable. The harsh reality, you're going to do some things as a line prosecutor you don't want to do. So the goal is, if you can't stomach that, to do your research and make yourself where you are mobile to go identify prosecutors' offices. And even in my office, I have conversations. I'll tell my young lawyers who I have relations, stay close to me. I know it's hard, stay close to me, because they have minimum mandatories that I try to stay consistent. So the truth is, you have to bite it, but you become much more valuable when you do have the experience.
And I went to an office, before like progressive prosecution was a thing. Like, I walked into an office knowing that like this dude and I are not simpatico. One thing that a lot of like progressive prosecutors are dealing with now is this: you said this policy decision that you made, but our line prosecutors aren't doing that. That can work the exact same other way, and that's what I was doing when I was a line prosecutor. Like, my DA didn't care about what was happening in the Roxbury District Court on marijuana cases. I was just diverting everything and building capital in that way. Because every time I like diverted some cases, I'd go to the kid's graduation, take a picture with the kid, send it to the DA, be like, "Oh, thank you, Mr. DA, for making this happen," blah blah blah, and start to work up from there to the point where it's just like there was so much capital built with the community, with the courts, with the defense bar, that then I was just like, I'm going to divert this armed robbery. And now what you going to do? So it's about like finding your way to build that capital, because yes, like there were moments that I had to hold my nose because I knew that I was part of this system. I love Marby's comments about harm mitigation. That's really how I slept at night, was like, it's better that I'm here than Chad. But while doing that, I was doing everything in my power to build capital so that I could flex those muscles once I got to the spot.
Thank you.
Thank you for your question.
Hello, my name is Saraswati Singh, and I'm a new prosecutor from Minnesota. My boss is a progressive ACS member, and he's been hiring a lot of us progressive lawyers and law students. My question is, how can us new line trial attorneys help the DA, help you guys do your work and accelerate the change that we want to do, like increase diversion, et cetera?
Can I answer this one? I'm so happy you asked. One of the things I did when taking office is create committees for the office. And one of those is a millennial committee. And I said to my district court attorneys, it is your cohorts that we are prosecuting. It is the folks in your generation that are most impacted by the decisions we make. And I want you to be a part of the change that this county and this system needs. And so we are in the process right now of collecting a lot of data around the work that this office has done over the last 4 or 5 years. And I'm new. And so, and also we're going to look at what we've done over the past year. But we know that there are categories of cases that we would like to divert and provide, resources for those diversions. But I thought it was really important for my young prosecutors to be a part of making that switch and that change. So if you don't have a millennial committee or a young lawyers committee in your office, I would highly suggest making that recommendation. They're going to go out into the community and host happy hours and other events to engage people who, they can connect with. And again, those are the people most impacted by the system. I value the young attorneys. They are the future of our office, but not only that, they are the future of our criminal justice system. It's their values that are going to determine whether or not some of the policies that I am making will be sustained in the future. So you are, you are important too, but I'm just saying people who are in your age group and those young attorneys are so critical to the work that I do in the office.
And I'll just say quickly, look, you are where the rubber meets the road. When we're trying to change the culture, and I've had this conversation with the docket attorneys and misdemeanor attorneys in our office, when we have a new attorney come in, they're not going to hang out with the supervisor. They're going to hang out with you. And when we have mission-oriented attorneys like yourself that are there where the case comes in to our office, I don't think that there's anything more important. So that's been an emphasis with me, is that making sure that I'm bringing progressive-minded young people into our office to help start changing that culture. Because as Adam knows, I came into an office of a 30-year administration, and I have civil service rules to deal with. So I can't just get rid of people for no reason. And so I have to be very deliberate about the hires that we make in our office. And I sit and I will go and hide in their offices and just talk to them and remind them how important they are, and just so they can continue to see things how I see things. I want them to know that when they have a disagreement, how they handle it is important, because they are setting that culture. So
I want to help real quickly too. The most important person in my office, I call the competent woke assistant state attorney. Like, it's one thing to be woke, it's another thing to be competent. We need both, right? And I'm serious.
No,
Like,
I saw Green Book. It was...
So the other thing, and it's going to sound a little weak, be the tattletale. I need tattletales to tell me when middle management isn't doing, your boss isn't doing, become my friend because I value that insight.
Yeah, there's this pervasive culture that, like, you got to go through this hazing to rise up. No. The private sector hasn't figured out. They took young people and they put them in the executive staff, and everything got better because culture got better. Young people think about things like wellness and mission and culture. And what I saw in St. Louis, one of the most impressive things was the youngest attorney sitting in the room with the DA talking shit about things that are happening in the office. And this man understanding that this is not somehow against my ego or against my authority. This is going to make me a better office. Right. That is what you can do regardless of where you go.
And I know who he's talking about, too.
Thank you.
Thank you for your question. It was great.
Thank you.
Hi,
brother.
So, hey, what's
Very
going
good
on?
to see
So
you, man.
randomly, I'm traveling on a case probably about 3 weeks ago, and who do I see in the airport in like Jacksonville with Adam? So it's great to see you
Great
again.
to see you, brother.
I'm a huge fan of all of you all up here, right? And so I want to ask a question that I'm very serious about. So in front of you all, in your offices, you mainly see people coming from the same communities, right? So my question is this: when are we going to start prosecuting the people who we are putting in positions to take care of our communities for neglecting our communities? And let me go deeper on that. See, I've been on both sides of the criminal justice table. I was once falsely accused, ultimately wrongfully convicted, spent almost 10 years in prison before the Innocence Project got me out. I came home in 2007. Thank you. So I came home in 2007, went to school, graduated from Loyola, clerked in the same circuit that overturned my conviction, and now I'm a lawyer and I have my own law office in New York. So what bothers me is this. I continue to go to court, I handle the cases that I handle, and I turn to walk out of the courtroom, and the entire pool of people are the same, each and every day. So if we know that prosecuting, locking people up isn't going to get us out of this situation, when do we start holding the people that we vote into office accountable for our communities, the school systems, the jobs that are not there? We have 2.3 million people incarcerated. Of that 2.3 million people, it's like 900,000 black men. And that's not by accident. So my question again may be one of that has many different angles to get into it, but we are simply going to continue to do what we're doing until we start holding people responsible for neglecting these communities.
I'm going to agree with you. And my answer to your question, until we have legislation that supports prosecutors to do this, we're going to get dismissed in court, get dismantled, lose our integrity. I got an indictment on a police officer who shot and killed an unarmed person. I had to file a dismissal after getting an indictment because I knew I could not get past a jury. And even if I could get past a jury, then I know what my district courts of appeal looks like and how they're going to interpret the facts. And then if I can get past that, the same Supreme Court who knows me by name, what do you think they're going to do with the case? So the reality is we have to stop putting that on the shoulders of a prosecutor. This movement of prosecution can backfire to make it look like we own all of that. I don't own the legislation. I don't own the judiciary. It is on the people, where we have to together begin to educate them on the power of their vote for their legislators, even their judiciary. And if you have where you vote for your judges, where they come back up for their reelection, whatever that is, because I only can prosecute what I'm given. And even if I want to interpret the facts the way that I want to, I have to be very honest about how my juries and the judges will as well.
And your question is serious, but I'm smiling because I can't tell you how proud I am of you.
Thank you.
I had there is an attorney in my office, and when we were expanding, when we were talking about expanding diversion programs at an unprecedented level in our region, she made the comment, and one of my tattletales told me about this comment, that, well, we seem to only care about defendants. And Elizabeth Brazil came to our office. We invited her, and she graciously accepted and came to talk to our office. So I intentionally kind of asked this question so that she wouldn't know that it was directly related to her comment. She didn't know that I knew about it. But I said, you know, we hear about when we talk about diversion and restorative justice, we get the pushback that we only care about defendants. But how many of you have looked at the number of defendants who have records, who are the victims who have been or will be defendants? Mm-hmm. And we have to start realizing that this is the same population. So if you only care about victims, that's fine. I am very supportive of our victims. But we're talking about those who often are in the same place. So when we help one, we're helping both of them. And to answer your question directly, though, I think to Aramis's point, this is a movement. Mm-hmm. This is a movement, and we're just the tip of the spear. Right. And so if you say, well, we got a progressive prosecutor in, I'm going to go sit down now, then we're missing the point. We have to continue to push. So now we have to look for progressive governors, progressive state legislators, state senators, mm-hmm. congressmen, everything, so we can start getting legislation in place to give us the ability to do that. Because we've seen issues of people who have taken on, in my state, taking on people in the highest seats of government, yeah, and how they are being attacked now. And so we need that support, and the more people we have in place to help give us that support, the better and more effective and more comprehensive job that we can do, to your point.
Right. Well, thank you. I thank you guys, and I don't want to take up all this time, but
thank you, Joe.
I commend you all on your bravery, and I just say, just keep at it, because
thanks for sharing.
Where you may lose in a legal court, you can still win in the court of public opinion. So thank you all.
Thank you, bro.
I just had a question about kind of, as you all as progressive prosecutors and people and advocates in working in this space, how you view your role as it relates to other systems that interact with the criminal justice system, and specifically as a former public defender in the Bronx, I'm thinking mostly about child welfare, because as we work on kind of different programs within our criminal justice system to decriminalize certain behavior, decriminalize substance abuse, mental health issues, often that mitigation and that evidence or that mitigating kind of information that's gathered in the prosecution and after the arrest is then used against those families, yes, in child welfare, and those families are then separated for sometimes 2, 4, 5 years. And what I saw a lot was that when there was good prosecutors in the Bronx who were declining to prosecute marijuana cases, my clients were then separated from their children or terminated because they used marijuana occasionally. And those are the easy examples, and the marijuana cases, the substance abuse cases. But I'm just curious how, and if you see a role for the kind of the progressive prosecutor in those systems and how they interact.
Can I thank you. And to Marbre, and I don't want to mispronounce it, Marbre's point earlier, I do believe communities are the best place to address these issues. And what I would add to that is, I'm a part of this community. Right. I've been a part of the community long before I was a prosecutor, and dealing with young people, elderly people, and everyone in between. And as a prosecutor, I'm not changing that. And Captain Farmer and I, we do a lot of work long before we were in these positions, prior to doing prior to coming into the office where we were doing this kind of engagement. And so I do see my role as being able to help outside of just that lane in prosecution, using my platform to push for healthcare, for healthcare, for protecting women's reproductive rights. I'm going to use that platform. And I don't care if anybody has a problem with it. If you don't like it, in 2022 I'll be up. Get someone else in there. So I do see our role as more broad, and now there are some things that we are experts on, and we need to partner with other institutions and things of that nature. But I do think we have an obligation to be more involved and be more active and be more visible, and to use our role to benefit people and help people.
I want to add to that. I think not only are we committed to it, the biggest part is education. We sit up here as champions, but until you just said that, I never thought about it, and I've been in office for over 2 years. Mm-hmm. So a lot of it is you don't get up here without some level of humility, right, to know that what's right. So I think most of us are open enough that maybe your direction is to identify the organizer who is going to help get us in place so that they can communicate it directly to us so that we know and make this a priority. It's the squeaky wheel syndrome.
Just 2 quick thoughts. I think part of the point I made around kind of the firewall between supportive services and social work and all of that and the criminal legal system and prosecution is that point, is that so often when folks expose vulnerable information, seeking help because we've divested so much from basic infrastructure, DA's offices are really a place where folks are getting treatment and support, and it shouldn't be, but because of how funding goes, it is. And so when folks then disclose details about their life, it's often then weaponized against them. And so I think just like re-emphasizing how important I think it is to actually be thinking about that, like this is not, and this is part of I think an overburdening that someone mentioned of prosecutors, of like it's not their job to solve all of the problems, right? They have a lane, and what does it mean for us to fund and support folks who are actually doing that work in other places, and to firewall information so that information is not being used and weaponized against people. I also think, and I think that Wesley mentioned this around kind of the power of prosecutors to advocate in other spaces is just so important, and they have a lot of power. I know there's a lot of opposition against progressive prosecutors inside the system, but still yield real power, and so how can they educate and agitate in ways that actually bring that to the forefront? And I think even, Wesley's kind of decriminalization of child support, for instance, moving that from a criminal offense to a non-criminal offense is like a way of signaling that we should be dealing with these issues differently in different spaces. So I think it's important that folks lead by example, but also clear about like what we are not doing and what we cannot do, and how do we firewall information to make sure that folks aren't actually being vulnerable because they are sharing information.
But I would like to say, having been in this role, what I realize is that perhaps historically it has not been the role of the prosecutor to involve themselves in certain aspects of our society. And maybe that was the problem. Because, again, because of the broad discretion of the prosecutor, because we have so much power within the system, if we are reform-minded, if we are thoughtful, if we do involve ourselves in other aspects of society, I think we're in a really strong position to influence change. I'll give you an example. Before becoming a prosecutor, I worked for Children's National Health System, which is the largest pediatric provider in this region. And one of the things I started when I was there was a trauma-informed training for law enforcement, for court personnel on recognizing signs of trauma, what adverse childhood experiences are, and how best to address young people who exhibit certain behaviors in their courtroom, how to de-escalate. We also provided that training for school resource officers. It was, and I made that as I was running for office, I talked about that. And I realized that the prosecutor is in a really strong position to make recommendations on what are some needs in our society, because we see people at their worst. We see both victims when they come to us. A lot of them have had experiences that none of us should have, right? But even the defendants, we have to look at them and look at their experiences, and we make decisions on whether we're going to prosecute, which charges we're going to move forward with, what diversion opportunities we may consider them for. The reality is it does take more than just being a strong litigator to be an effective prosecutor, because the prosecutor is not just about prosecuting, it's about keeping the community safe. And sometimes that involves prosecution, but other times it involves something else. And so prosecutors have to be more dynamic. We can't just be thought of as just simply people in a criminal justice system. We are problem solvers within our community. And if we're not at the table talking about issues of housing, talking about issues of healthcare, talking about issues of education, then we are missing the point and our community loses out. Because again, when it comes to the system, this system, no matter whether or not you like the system, it is the prosecutor that has the ultimate discretion. And you have to have smart, well-rounded prosecutors who are going to be more thoughtful and who are going to involve themselves in things other than simply just the prosecution of criminals.
And you know, this kind of goes back to your question. As individual prosecutors, first of all, it's negligent the way that we're taught how to do our jobs, and that we don't understand the intersection between education, housing, healthcare, all of these things, social determinants, and people who end up in our system. And so one thing is for groups like this to be advocating for different types of legal education while we're in law school.
That's right.
About why do people end up here? Because as a line prosecutor, if I'm handed one tool, jail or not, and I'm told to solve this problem, that's a false choice. But if I understand this person's in front of me because they've had a trauma history, because they lack housing, they're housing insecure, they might not be homeless, they had bad educational outcomes, but this is particularly true in the juvenile unit. Now you have a prosecutor who should not be providing services, but certainly can use other tools than jail to solve those problems. Absolutely. And to make that sort of like known to the public and the community, and sort of something that Marbury said was, every kid that was arrested for handguns in public housing, I was going to the housing court to testify on behalf of the family to not evict their children, to not evict the family because of this stupid law. When I was getting thousands of school-based arrests, I took all of those school-based arrests, I went back up to the school and I'm like, I'm not prosecuting one of these. Right. We need to think of something different and work with them to get a grant to get restorative justice as a shitty little line prosecutor. And so when you talk about like our ability as elected officials to be doing this, like we are one of the most powerful lobbies when it comes to legislation. You know how legislatures work and how long it takes for stuff to happen. One day, this young white college student had a guy take a picture up her skirt on the subway. There was no law against it, and she was super offended. Her parents were offended. Everybody freaked out. The legislature passed a law in one day. And so why can't we do that when the impact is systemic and there's plenty of data to suggest that we might have to do something different? Prosecutors should be taking that role and going with the legislatures and saying, you cannot arrest kids in school unless you go through these 8 things before you bring them to us.
And you know, just to add to,
She's like, I just want to listen out.
Yeah, go ahead.
It's a symbiotic relationship. You know, when we get out into the community, I think that the community does benefit from us being at the table, but on the other side of that, we benefit from hearing from our community. Yeah. When I look at my platform when I ran for office, it was 100% based on conversations that I had from knocking on doors and going to town hall meetings and just showing up at any kind of meeting. So I think that's so important, and that's why we created the role of community engagement with Captain Farmer. So I think it's incumbent on us to be involved.
Sorry for all the people behind this, brother, but we have like 3 minutes left. We're going to try to don't give up. Don't give up. We're going to see how we can do here.
Yeah, my question's great.
All right, great.
Good afternoon. My name is Pedro Naveras. I'm a rising 3L as well. Hoping to be a prosecutor. My question is for my prosecutors as minorities. I think you mentioned you were like one of 30 in Florida. So a lot of my classmates in the Black Law Student Association in La Raza all want to be public defenders. And criticize the few minorities that do want to be prosecutors, that do have this vision of becoming progressive prosecutors. So I guess my question is, what's your advice to respond to that? That, I'm not just trying to put more Mexicans in jail for doing drugs or more black kids in jail just for existing on the corner.
I've done both, and one of the criticisms from one of our local commissioners, she doesn't know that I know, but she said if she wants to make all these changes, she should have run for public defender. The reality is that it's the stupidest thing I've ever heard in my life, because why would I fight for change that I can just decide to make?
Yeah.
Like that, so the difference is, do you want to live to fight, or do you want to live to make the change?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I guess the rising 3L, that's a new thing. I didn't know about being a rising 3L, which I think
2.5L just sounds
cool.
weird.
It's pretty cool. But, as a former public defender, I would say the same thing. I wanted to, I think many attorneys at some point, want to be a judge. And when you're young, you think, one day I want to be a judge. And I got an opportunity to do that. And it didn't take long to realize that the real impact came from the prosecutor's office. By the time the case came to me, over 90% of them had already been worked out, and the prosecutor got what they wanted. And so if you, and as a public defender, you are zealously fighting for your clients, but you're at the whim of a reasonable prosecutor or an unreasonable prosecutor. But when you are the individual that can disseminate fairness and justice and say, hey, you know what, maybe we can give this person an opportunity. Maybe we can give this person some alternatives, send them to some kind of treatment. I mean, what else could you ask for? It goes back to that circular firing squad. We need good people on all sides for the criminal justice system to work.
The other thing,
I was going to say, when I was at 2L, I actually met the then elected prosecutor in my county at a Black Law Student Association meeting, and I was at Howard, so we're very radical there, and and so I said, so when we had a conversation, and at the end he says, hey, if you ever want to come and work for my office, give me a call. You can intern and come and work for the office. And I said to myself, I took his card. It's like, he's a very nice man, but there is no way I'm going to work for him. I didn't tell him that, but I was thinking to myself, there's no way I'm going to work for him, because I don't want to be a part of a system that puts black men in jail, period. And then, 19 years later, here I am.
So, I really don't want to lose sight of this point. The reality is our criminal justice system is a revolving door. People need representation when they're victims of crime as well. Too often, and I have spoken directly to Trayvon Martin's parents, and I told him he was the impetus to me going back to the state attorney's office, because too many people were confused about the diversity. To black people, he was our little cousin who got into trouble.
Right.
To people who didn't understand some of the black culture, he was the little thug. So you have to have people on the inside to properly characterize victims of crime. So the key is, do you want to represent the defendant solely, or do you want to be a voice for victims who are brown and who are black, as well as making sure that there's a just outcome for the defendant as well? And that is the most powerful position.
I only wanted to be a public defender. Only want to be a public defender. I would never, ever think about being a prosecutor. 10 years after being a prosecutor, I kept thousands of people out of jail and prison.
And that's real.
And I have relationships with those people to this day because of the way that I represented them. And that is all the argument that I ever needed. Full stop. Thousands of people. And I never would have been able to do that because I did have the power on this side to have done that on the other side. We are out of time. Sorry, gentlemen. We are out of time. Please join me in a round of applause for these amazing...